My name is Lily Thompson, and at 25, I've learned more about sacrifice than I'd ever wanted to. From the outside, my life might look like the perfect picture of resilience and determination. I graduated with honors, landed a stable job in marketing, and supported myself entirely since leaving college. But behind the polished exterior lies a family history steeped in manipulation, favoritism, and unspoken resentment. My father, Michael, is the kind of man who tries to be all things to everyone. After my mother passed away when I was 15, he shouldered the burden of raising me alone. Or at least that's what I believed until Karen entered the picture 2 years later. Karen, his second wife, was nothing like my mom. Where my mother was warm and nurturing, Karen was cold, calculated, and ambitious. She prided herself on getting things done, and unfortunately for me, that often meant placing her own children, Emily and Jake, at the center of our family's universe. At first, I tried to be optimistic. Karen promised to bring stability to our fractured home, and I believed her. I wanted to believe her. But it didn't take long for me to realize that her promises came with conditions. Emily and Jake, younger than me by a few years, were coddled, praised, and given every opportunity, while I became the family's afterthought. My accomplishments were met with polite indifference, while their every minor achievement was celebrated with fanfare. The shift in dynamics was subtle at first. Karen insisted that my father and I make room for her kids, which seemed reasonable on the surface. But that room came at a cost. My bedroom, once my safe haven, was moved to the smaller guest room to accommodate Jake's gaming setup. Emily, a budding fashion enthusiast, was encouraged to borrow my clothes, jewelry, and even my makeup, none of which ever found its way back to me in one piece. I tried to brush off these slights, telling myself that things would get better if I worked hard and kept my head down. I focused on school, determined to earn a scholarship and carve out a life for myself. And when I got into a prestigious university on a partial scholarship, I thought I'd finally earned my father's approval. But even my education became a sore point in our home. Karen insisted that my living expenses were a luxury the family couldn't afford. "You're smart, Lily," she said with a saccharine smile. "I'm sure you'll figure out a way to manage without us." And I did. I worked late shifts at a diner, juggled freelance projects, and lived on instant noodles to make ends meet. My father, reluctant to contradict Karen, offered occasional help, but his efforts were half-hearted at best. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake continued to live in comfort, with Karen footing the bill for their extracurricular activities, tutors, and even lavish vacations. The latest chapter of this saga began 3 months ago, when Karen and my father announced their plans to renew their vows. They were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary and decided to go all out. A grand ceremony, a luxury venue, and a second honeymoon to Paris. At first, I was indifferent. These kinds of events had become routine for Karen, who thrived on attention and extravagance. But one evening, as I was returning home from work, Karen cornered me in the kitchen with an air of rehearsed sweetness. "Lily, we need to talk," she began, her tone just shy of condescending. I set down my bag, already bracing for whatever request was coming. "What's up?" "Well," she said, glancing toward the living room where my father was watching TV, "Michael and I have been planning something special for our anniversary, a romantic trip to Paris. But there's just one small problem." I didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between us. "We need someone to stay with Emily and Jake," Karen continued. "Just for 2 weeks. You'd barely notice they're here." "Barely notice?" I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Karen, I work full-time. I'm not a babysitter." Karen's expression hardened, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "I understand you're busy, Lily, but family comes first. Michael and I have sacrificed so much for you. This is your chance to give back." Her words hit me like a slap. Sacrificed for me? I thought about all the hours I'd spent working to pay for my own education, the countless ways I'd bent over backward to avoid being a burden. And now, they wanted me to take on more responsibility without so much as a discussion. I glanced at my father, hoping for some kind of support, but he just stared at the TV, avoiding my gaze. It was as if he wasn't even in the room. "Karen," I said, my voice trembling with frustration, "I can't do this. I have work. I have commitments. Why can't Emily and Jake stay with their father?" Karen's face darkened. "Daniel is unreliable," she snapped. And frankly, this attitude of yours is disappointing. We're a family, Lily. Families help each other. I bit back the urge to scream, knowing that any protest would only escalate the situation. I'll think about it, I said instead, retreating to my room before she could press the issue further. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation in my head. The unfairness of it all made my chest ache, but what hurt most was my father's silence. He hadn't said a single word in my defense, choosing instead to let Karen dictate the terms of my involvement in their lives. I thought about calling Daniel, Karen's ex-husband, but the idea felt too drastic. Besides, Karen would likely spin the narrative to make me the villain. No, I needed to find another way to stand my ground without completely alienating myself from the family. The next morning, Karen cornered me again before I could leave for work. "So," she said, her tone deceptively light, "have you made a decision?" I looked her in the eye, summoning every ounce of courage I had. "I can't do it, Karen. I'm sorry." Her smile faltered, replaced by a steely glare. "You're making a mistake, Lily. Don't think for a second that this selfishness will go unnoticed." As I walked out the door, her words echoed in my mind, filling me with a mixture of anger and dread. This was just the beginning, and I knew that Karen wouldn't let it go. But for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of defiance, a small, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim control of my life. Karen's request to babysit Emily and Jake, while she and my father enjoyed their second honeymoon, was the first spark. But it didn't take long for the fire to spread. My refusal to comply had clearly struck a nerve, and Karen wasted no time making me the target of her passive-aggressive wrath. At first, it was small things. Emily and Jake began leaving their belongings in my room. Dirty clothes, half-eaten snacks, even an open bottle of nail polish that spilled on my desk. Karen dismissed it as a coincidence, saying, "They're just kids, Lily. Don't make a fuss." But the smirk on her face when she said it told me otherwise. Then came the utilities. I started noticing higher than usual electricity and water bills, and when I questioned Karen, she feigned ignorance. "Teenagers use a lot of water," she said with a shrug, pointing to Emily's hour-long showers and Jake's habit of leaving every light in the house on. When I suggested they cover the extra costs, Karen laughed. "You live here too, don't you? It's only fair that we split everything equally." I bit my tongue, knowing it wasn't worth the argument. But the final straw came 2 weeks later, during one of Karen's infamous family meetings. "Everyone, let's sit down," Karen announced one evening as we gathered in the living room. My father sat silently in his recliner, looking more like a spectator than a participant. Emily and Jake sprawled on the couch, their attention divided between their phones and the TV. I sat stiffly in the corner, bracing myself for whatever Karen had planned. "Michael and I have been going over the household budget," Karen began, holding a folder filled with neatly printed spreadsheets. "With the honeymoon coming up, we've realized we need to tighten our belts a bit." I raised an eyebrow. Tighten our belts? Karen and my father had just purchased new luggage, matching outfits for their trip, and a first-class upgrade for their flights. Meanwhile, I was still patching up the soles of my work shoes. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked cautiously. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Lily, we've decided to adjust the way we handle expenses. Since you're working full-time now, it only makes sense for you to contribute a little more. You know, for the sake of fairness." "Fairness," I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "I already pay for my own groceries and a portion of the utilities. What else do you expect me to cover?" "Rent," Karen said smoothly. "An additional $500 a month would help us cover the mortgage and keep things running smoothly." I stared at her, stunned. "You want me to pay rent? For a house I've lived in my entire life?" Karen's smile widened, and she tilted her head in that faux sympathetic way she always did when trying to sell her manipulations as reasonable. "It's not unreasonable, Lily. You're an adult now, and adults contribute. Besides, think of it as practice for when you get your own place." I looked at my father, hoping he'd step in, but he just shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding my gaze. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why not ask Emily and Jake to contribute?" I said, my voice trembling. "They're old enough to start pitching in too." Karen's expression hardened. "They're still in school. They have other priorities. But you," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "you're in a position to help." Over the next few weeks, Karen's demands only escalated. If I so much as questioned her decisions, She'd remind me of how much she and my father had sacrificed for me. When I asked for a breakdown of the expenses, she dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "You're being dramatic, Lily. Just pay your share and stop making everything so difficult." Meanwhile, Emily and Jake continued their carefree routines, oblivious to the strain they were putting on the household. Emily's online shopping habits spiraled out of control, with packages arriving daily, while Jake spent most of his time gaming, his room littered with energy drink cans and fast food wrappers. It all came to a head one evening when I came home to find my bedroom door wide open. Inside, Emily was trying on one of my work blouses, and Jake was rummaging through my desk drawers. "What the hell are you two doing?" I snapped, storming into the room. Emily rolled her eyes. "Relax, we're just borrowing." "Borrowing," I repeated, furious. "This isn't a thrift store. Put my stuff back and get out." Emily tossed the blouse onto my bed and sauntered out, muttering under her breath. Jake followed, but not before smirking and saying, "Chill out, Lily. It's just stuff." When I confronted Karen about it, she waved me off. "They're just kids," she said again, her tone dripping with condescension. "You should be setting an example, not blowing things out of proportion." The breaking point came when I received an overdraft notice from my bank. I hadn't authorized any extra expenses, so I checked my account history and found several unfamiliar charges. One of them, a $200 transaction, was for a boutique clothing store. When I brought it up to Karen, she didn't even try to deny it. "Oh, that was for Emily," she said casually. "She needed something for her school dance, and I figured you wouldn't mind covering it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You used my card without asking me?" "It was an emergency," Karen said, as though that justified it. "You're family, Lily. Family helps each other." Her words echoed in my mind, each one more infuriating than the last. Family helps each other. But where was that help when I needed it? Where was the fairness, the reciprocity, the acknowledgement of all the sacrifices I'd made? That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the piles of unpaid bills and the meager balance in my bank account. For years, I had let Karen and my father take advantage of me, convincing myself that it was my duty to keep the peace. But now, I realized that peace came at too high a cost. It was time to fight back. The storm brewing within my family's dynamic finally erupted, and the fallout was far worse than I could have anticipated. I had grown used to Karen's manipulative tendencies and my father's silent complicity, but their latest betrayal left me reeling in a way I hadn't thought possible. It started on a Friday evening. I had just come home after a long day at work, ready to collapse into bed, when Karen greeted me at the door with an unusually chipper tone. "Lily, we need to talk," she said, a sugary sweetness coating her words. I felt a familiar wave of dread wash over me. Nothing good ever followed those words. "Can it wait?" I asked, setting my bag down. "I've had a long day." "No, it can't," she said firmly. "It's about the house." My stomach twisted. "What about the house?" Karen motioned for me to follow her into the living room. My father was already seated on the couch, his face blank as usual. Emily and Jake were nowhere to be seen, which immediately made me suspicious. They never missed a chance to be part of Karen's schemes. Karen took a deep breath, her expression a mix of smugness and faux concern. "Michael and I have been discussing our financial situation, and we've decided to make some changes to ensure everyone is contributing fairly." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes?" "Well," Karen began, drawing out the word like she was savoring it. "We've decided to sell the house." The words hit me like a freight train. "What?" "We've already found a buyer," she continued, ignoring my stunned reaction. "It's a great deal, and it'll allow us to move into a smaller, more manageable place." "Smaller?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Where exactly do you plan on putting me in this new, manageable place?" Karen smiled, a hint of triumph flickering in her eyes. "Oh, Lily, you're an adult. It's time for you to find your own space." The room spun as her words sank in. "You're kicking me out?" I asked, disbelief and anger warring within me. "Not kicking out," Karen said, as if that distinction mattered. "Encouraging you to spread your wings? You've been talking about wanting independence, haven't you?" As if that bombshell wasn't enough, Karen's next words turned my shock into pure fury. "We were going to wait to tell you until after the sale went through, but since you're here..." Karen paused, looking almost gleeful. We used the emergency fund you've been saving to cover some of the upfront costs. You'll get it back eventually, of course. What did you just say? My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Karen's expression hardened. Lily, don't act so dramatic. You're part of this family, and family sacrifices for each other. We needed the money to secure the down payment on the new house. It's not a big deal. It's a huge deal, I snapped, my hands shaking. That money wasn't for you. It was mine. I've been saving for years to start my own business. Karen's face twisted into a look of mock pity. Oh, Lily, businesses fail all the time. Don't you think it's better to invest in something tangible, like a home? My father finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. Karen's right, Lily. It's for the greater good. The greater good? I repeated, my voice cracking. You stole from me, and you're trying to justify it with some twisted version of family values? How can you even say that with a straight face? Karen crossed her arms, her tone turning icy. You're overreacting. It's not like you were going to use that money anytime soon. And besides, we're family. We're supposed to share. I stormed out of the living room, my chest heaving with anger. In my room, I frantically searched for my savings ledger, the notebook where I meticulously tracked every dollar I'd earned and saved. When I opened the drawer, my stomach dropped. It was gone. I tore through the rest of my belongings, but the ledger was nowhere to be found. It didn't take long to realize what had happened. Karen must have taken it, likely weeks ago, when she started plotting this scheme. The violation of my privacy stung almost as much as the theft itself. Rage bubbled inside me as I marched back into the living room, holding nothing back. You had no right to touch my money, Karen. And you, I said, turning to my father, you're just as guilty for letting her do this. Lily, calm down, Karen said, feigning concern. You're making a scene. Damn right, I'm making a scene, I shouted. You lied to me, stole from me, and now you're trying to kick me out of my own home. How do you even sleep at night? Karen's face darkened. Watch your tone, young lady. We've given you everything. Food, shelter, a place to stay while you get your life together. And this is how you repay us? With accusations and disrespect? I owe you nothing, I spat. If anything, you owe me, for every bill I've paid, every sacrifice I've made, and every time I put up with your manipulative garbage. That night, I locked myself in my room, trying to process what had just happened. The betrayal was a slap in the face, but it was also a wake-up call. Karen and my father would never see me as anything more than a resource to exploit. They didn't care about my dreams, my hard work, or my well-being. The next morning, I made a decision. If they wanted me out of the house so badly, I'd go, but not before making it clear that I wouldn't be their scapegoat any longer. It was time to take control of my life, and if that meant burning bridges, so be it. The following morning, I woke up with a sharp sense of clarity. The anger from the night before still simmered beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by a newfound determination. Karen and my father had made their choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. I stepped into the kitchen where Karen was sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone. My father sat at the table, his eyes avoiding mine as he read the newspaper. The casual normalcy of the scene made my blood boil. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Karen glanced up, feigning surprise. Oh, Lily, are you still upset about last night? I thought we'd moved past that. Moved past it? I repeated, incredulous. You stole from me, Karen. Don't act like this is just a little misunderstanding. She sighed dramatically, setting her mug down. I already explained this to you. It wasn't stealing. It was reallocating resources. Family resources. That's a nice way to spin theft, I said, crossing my arms. But it doesn't change what you did. My father finally looked up from his paper, his face lined with discomfort. Lily, maybe we could all sit down and have a calm conversation about this. Oh, we'll have a conversation, I said, my tone cold. But let me make one thing clear. I'm done letting you two walk all over me. Karen leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips. And what exactly does that mean? It means, I said, taking a step closer, that I'm cutting you off. No more paying bills, no more covering for your irresponsible decisions, and definitely no more letting you use me as your personal ATM. Karen's smirk faltered. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm dead serious, I said. I've been working my ass off to save for my future, and you had the audacity to steal from me and call it family values. You don't get to demand anything from me anymore." My father looked genuinely alarmed. "Lily, don't do anything rash. We're a family. We need to stick together." "Funny how that only applies when you're asking me to sacrifice," I shot back. "When Karen decided to dip into my savings, where was that sense of family then? Or when you stood by and let her take advantage of me for years?" Karen stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Everything you've done for me?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Let's talk about that. You've taken my money, my time, and my peace of mind. You've manipulated and guilted me into thinking I owed you something, all while treating me like an afterthought. That ends today." Karen's composure crumbled, and she pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're just being dramatic. You'll come crawling back when you realize how much you need us." "No, Karen," I said firmly. "You need me. That's why you've been milking me for everything I have. But guess what? You're on your own now." I turned to my father, hoping for some glimmer of understanding. Instead, he just shook his head. "Lily, don't do this. You'll regret it." "Maybe," I admitted. "But I'd rather regret standing up for myself than spend another second letting you two control my life." Karen scoffed. "Fine. If you want to ruin your life, go ahead. But don't expect us to help you when you fall flat on your face." "I won't," I said, heading for the door, "because I don't need your help. And I never did." That afternoon, I began packing my things. Karen tried to guilt me into staying, throwing out every excuse she could think of. But I didn't waver. My father barely said a word, his silence speaking louder than anything else. By the time I loaded the last of my belongings into my car, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. This house had been my home for so long, but it had never truly felt like one. Leaving it behind felt less like a loss and more like shedding a heavy weight. Karen stood on the porch, watching me with a look of disdain. "You'll regret this, Lily," she called out as I got into my car. "You're making a huge mistake." I rolled down the window and looked at her one last time. "No, Karen. My only mistake was letting you treat me like this for so long. But that's over now." As I drove away, the reality of my decision began to sink in. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the constant manipulation, the guilt, and the feeling of being trapped in a toxic cycle. I wasn't sure where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Wherever it would be mine. And that was enough. Driving away from my father and Karen's house marked the beginning of my independence, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in my life, I was free from their suffocating control, and that realization was as terrifying as it was liberating. But I knew one thing for certain: I would never go back to that toxic environment. The first few weeks were overwhelming. I found a modest studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far enough away to ensure Karen and my father couldn't easily drop by unannounced. It wasn't much: a small kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and just enough space for a bed and desk. But it was mine. No one could take it from me, and that made it feel like a palace. I threw myself into my work. My boss had noticed my recent focus and determination, and after a few weeks of consistent performance, I was given a major project to lead. It was nerve-wracking, but also exhilarating. For the first time, I was able to channel all the energy I had wasted on my family into something meaningful. By the end of the quarter, I'd exceeded expectations. The client was thrilled, and my boss rewarded me with a well-deserved promotion. Standing in his office as he handed me the letter confirming my raise, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't experienced in years. I was finally being recognized for my hard work, not taken advantage of for it. Without Karen's constant demands draining my resources, I began to prioritize myself for the first time. I started going to therapy, something I had put off for years because of my financial commitments to my family. My therapist helped me unpack the years of guilt and manipulation I had endured, showing me that I wasn't selfish for wanting boundaries. I was simply human. I also took up hobbies I'd neglected for years. I joined a yoga class and started painting again, filling my weekends with activities that brought me joy. My tiny apartment quickly became a sanctuary, its walls adorned with my colorful canvases. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Karen and my father had stolen. Karen and my father didn't let go of me quietly. For weeks after I moved out, my phone was bombarded with texts and calls. Karen alternated between furious accusations and pitiful attempts to guilt me back into her life. My father's messages were no better, filled with thinly veiled threats about how I'd regret abandoning my family. I blocked both of their numbers. That decision wasn't easy. Cutting ties with them felt like severing a part of myself, but it was necessary. Every time I thought about unblocking them, I remembered the years of sacrifice and pain they had caused me. I owed them nothing. Months passed, and I was finally finding my rhythm. Then one day, there was a knock at my door. Opening it, I was surprised to find my father standing there, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. I hesitated before stepping aside. He sat awkwardly on the edge of my couch, fidgeting with his hands. "Karen and we're struggling," he began. "She mismanaged the money. We're in debt. I thought maybe you could help." I stared at him, incredulous. "You came here to ask me for money?" He flinched. "No, not just that. I wanted to apologize too, for everything." His words caught me off guard, but I couldn't ignore the sting of his request. "You think saying sorry will erase all the years you let Karen walk all over me? That you stood by while she drained me dry?" He looked down, ashamed. "I know I failed you, Lily, but I'm here now, trying to make things right." I shook my head. "Making things right doesn't mean coming to me for a bailout. It means taking responsibility for your actions. I can't fix this for you, Dad. Not anymore." He left shortly after, and though I didn't give him what he wanted, I felt lighter, knowing I had stood firm. While my family ties unraveled, other relationships in my life flourished. My best friend, Rachel, who had stood by me through everything, became my rock. We started spending more time together, and our bond deepened. She even encouraged me to join a community group where I met people who shared my interests and values. Through the group, I made friends who supported me without expecting anything in return. They celebrated my successes, comforted me in my struggles, and reminded me what true friendship looked like. For the first time in years, I felt surrounded by genuine care and kindness. As I settled into my new life, I found myself reflecting on everything I had endured. While Karen and my father's betrayal had hurt deeply, it had also taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, boundaries, and self-worth. I learned that I couldn't control how others treated me, but I could control how I responded. By walking away from their toxicity, I had reclaimed my power and built a life that was truly mine. Months after our last interaction, I received a letter from Karen. It was unusually short and surprisingly devoid of her usual dramatics. "Lily, I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to let you know I'm sorry. I've started therapy, and I'm trying to understand why I am the way I am. I hope one day we can talk. Karen." I didn't know if I would ever respond, but the fact that she had taken even this small step gave me hope, not for reconciliation, but for her own growth. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood in my apartment, sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. My paintings lined the walls. My inbox was filled with congratulations from colleagues on my latest promotion, and my calendar was dotted with plans to meet friends. For the first time in years, my life felt like my own. I wasn't living for anyone else's approval or trying to fix anyone else's mess. I was thriving, and it was the most freeing feeling in the world. I had fought hard for this peace, and I intended to cherish every moment of it.